the inaugural episode of Theology Untapped. I'm your host, Peter Conacher, joined here with Alan and Regina Verghese.
Hey.
Hey there, Peter.
So, today we plan on going over a few things. First, we're going to introduce you to ourselves. Next, after that, we're going to go over what Theology Untapped means and what it means to us as well.
Yep.
And then finally, we plan on going over what our plans for the future are for this podcast.
Sounds great.
That's correct.
Right. So, tell me more about yourselves.
Yes.
Alan?
Hi, I'm Alan Verghese. It's great to be part of this podcast. I'm currently based in North Carolina, and I'm doing my theological studies, graduate studies in Duke University. Obviously, I'm excited about theology. That's why I'm doing my theology graduate studies. So when this proposal of having this podcast come up, I was excited, and that's why I'm here. We look forward to interacting more with you and your challenging questions. That's the small snippet of who I am. I'll let Regina introduce herself.
Thanks, Alan. Basically, I'm married to Alan, and I have worked in the medical field. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, went to churches here my whole life. And I think for me, a main thing is to see a lot of the tough questions in Christianity and living in this world addressed. And I'm excited to see a lot of that addressed in our podcast.
That's good. Peter.
Yeah. You guys got my first and last name, Peter Conacher. I live in Oklahoma City, lived here all my life. I'm actually a nurse at one of the hospitals in the city. And I enjoy theology, I enjoy the concepts of it, and it's a pet project every now and then to look into it when I do get time. So I enjoyed the discussions and philosophical aspect of it as well. So now that you guys have a glimpse into who we are, let's go on to untapping this theology. So Alan, what does Theology Untapped mean?
The term untapped in plain English is defined as a supply of something valuable, not yet used or taken advantage of. Now that's a definition given in Cambridge Dictionary.
So, some of our listeners might be wondering, well, does that mean that there's a new, fresh supply of theology that we're coming up with? Are we making new theology up here, Alan?
Well, not really. But what we are trying to understand is actually bring a certain element of theology that was hidden, or I would say that is still hidden. For example, we are introducing the Christian theology that has been framed and shaped by a South Asian Pentecostal background. Now, I just mentioned South Asian Pentecostal background as one untapped theology. People, those who are growing up right now in a South Asian Pentecostal background, they're well aware of what theologies goes inside of the church when it comes to teaching theologies and teaching biblical scriptures and everything. But rest of the world have probably a different outlook. If you go to an American Baptist home, they might not understand some of the things the South Asian Pentecostal Christian thinker is actually going through.
So you're basically saying that our Christian values are shaped by our culture, and that highly influences how we see theology.
Yes, because even though Christian theology, the heart of Christian theology is Christ, even though that's the foundation for any Christian, universal Christian, but it's been perceived culturally as you grew up. If you grew up in India, or if you grew up in an Indian background, you would see Christ in an Indian perspective.
Okay.
And if you grew up in other cultures, yes, there is a cultural element of perception, how you see Christianity.
I guess that's the beauty of Christianity. It can be shaped to any culture, and any culture can take it in as its own.
That's right, yes, without losing the core substance, foundation that's Christ.
Alan, that sounds pretty cool, but
yeah.
In theory, though, would we just be talking about theoretical theology, or are we doing anything practical with it?
Well, that's a nice term, theoretical theology. No, I mean, I would say a good theology should follow a good practice. And I think Gina has another point to share on what's the relevance of it.
Yeah, so basically with this podcast, we have recognized that in the 21st century, it's really hard to understand how to live a holy life when there's so many conflicting ideas. The news is telling you one thing, church is telling you one thing, but even the previous generation is telling you something that doesn't necessarily apply to today. So our goal is to take all of those hard to answer questions such as racism and sex and political views, all those kinds of things that no one really is addressing anymore in the church, or not addressing well at least, and to bring that to you guys, be your source for discourse basically, and hopefully we can get through to you guys and help you out.
Yep.
Definitely. So let's kind of go into each other's backgrounds here, just how we were brought up and what kind of got us to here, and were there any conflicts growing up in church?
I think in my background, I grew up in church. My parents are pastors in Pentecostal church in India, so I grew up in church 24/7. I would say I was a Christian from a very young age, but I had a sort of what I call it as like a regeneration of the Holy Spirit, regeneration of love of Christ later on in life. One frustration I would say was because of pastor's kid, a lot of expectations people have been telling us. You got to be a sample or a model for other people. So I think that grown on to me from a very young age. So I think all of my perspective later on about seeing God and religion and everything has ended up being an expectation. So Christianity at some point became a burden for me because it's an expectation you got to fulfill. So otherwise God is not going to be pleased with you.
So you kind of felt like a lot of pressure on being a pastor's kid.
Yeah, it took a long time for me to grow out of it.
Did you feel like people were watching you?
Oh, all the time. I mean, wherever you go. I mean, people like, it's not a bad thing. At some point I thought it was a good thing because like you get the best seats wherever you go. People invite you to stuff because your father is a pastor, right? I mean, it's a good thing. I'll enjoy it. But at the same time, I think a lot of pastors' kids would actually resonate with this. Like deep in our heart, if you mess up one thing, that's the thing. I mean, nobody would tell you anything off or anything until you mess up something. Or until you were seen outside of a pub or seen outside with somebody else you shouldn't be. Then it's going to go like a wildfire. And I think that's when the burden kicks in. But what happened, unfortunately, that translated into my view of Jesus Christ or Christianity and God, which is unfortunate. So it took a long time for me to shake it off.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
What about you, Gina?
I want to say a lot of my childhood was filled with kind of wanting to live a holy life and then being confused because I didn't know how wearing a headscarf would bring me to heaven or why jewelry was such a big deal. I mean, there were a lot of confusions as I was growing up, and I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it. And almost I felt like as a woman and as a girl, we were kind of told to step back. And then in my Western way of thinking, I wanted to be a feminist and be strong. And so it was a clash of everything. I felt like my culture was telling me to be quiet and be humble and serve with a smile all the time, whereas at my schools and stuff I was told to be outright and outspoken and not hide what I was thinking. So it was almost like I was living two different lives and I wasn't sure how that connected to Christ.
Gotcha. What do you think, Peter?
Well, I guess my upbringing was definitely interesting, to say the least. So my parents weren't pastors or anything like that, but my grandparents were. And so that was I guess my mom took that responsibility and decided that we need to live that example. So I grew up in the church, to say the least. I, from a young age, went to prayer meeting a lot. I believe 5 times during the week.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did the math.
Okay.
And I spent the equivalent of a year in prayer meeting. The church I grew up in was it was almost looked at as holiness is you being at church and showing up. And
so it's kind of like doing?
Yeah. It was more outward appearance.
Gotcha.
And so I grew up learning how to hide it really well. So I would go to church 5 times during the week, played in the band, was really eager and really excited about things, but a lot of people didn't have that same fervor, and that fervor was met with a lot of people that were burnt out, and so I got burnt out.
Okay.
And then I learned real quick how to hide my unholy behaviors.
Okay.
But
Makes sense.
going to church and being real spiritual and learning all these things, and I finally got to the point where I just wanted to know for myself what I believed in.
Did you want to run away at any time or leave the church?
Yeah, actually for a short period of time I was agnostic.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I kept it quite secret, and I didn't.
But you were still going to church.
Yes, and so I would go on Sunday, still play in the band, still praise and worship, and still act as if I'm really into it.
But you weren't sure if God was...
Yeah.
Oh,
I
wow.
was actually, I would put it as I was apathetic. I couldn't care less if God existed or not.
Yeah.
I just was ready to do my own thing. And
But
then,
at the same time, you felt like there's something out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, really, a few years ago, had experience with God at ICPF camp.
Yeah.
And that was a catalyst, and started seeking God after that.
Okay.
And it actually came down to me telling God, if you're out there, then you talk to me. Otherwise, I'm going to do my own thing.
Yeah. So really, I mean, I haven't heard your story before.
Yeah.
But it's really...
I feel like I've known you my whole life and I never even asked you. Sorry, Peter.
No worries.
That's cool. But yeah, good to hear the stories.
A lot of people will be wondering, and I'm also curious too, are you saying that we should avoid churches from our childhood?
No, not at all. Listen, I think we all shared our experiences growing up in churches and frustrations, which are valid. Some of us are still working through it, some of us have overcome it, but we are all still part of the church, and we ultimately found Christ. We found our salvation in Christ, and sometimes frustrations are good.
Yeah.
Go through it and come out of it. I think that's the key thing, and we got to understand that ultimately Christ is the center of everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons we want to make sure the podcast conveys rightly.
Yeah. Well, so that's how our upbringing and a little bit of our background. We plan on bringing more discussions and talks.
We are still in the process of figuring it out, but to start with, our plan is to keep this podcast discussion based. We are likely to have our friends coming and actually discussing some of these topics, and in some cases they are experts, they have PhDs or they have graduate studies in it. In some cases they are just normal Christians who are doing life. But the beauty of what we want to get out of this podcast is a discussion, so that our listeners could actually resonate with it. And also we're looking into a small segment of asking professionals. When I say professionals, I'm mentioning about people, those who are working in their own professions. For example, talking to a lawyer who is a Christian and ask how he sees Jesus Christ. So we are also looking into doing some interviews, small snippet of like 5-6 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's also in our mind.
Okay. So you talked about discussion. Do you think that maybe eventually there will be a way for our listeners to get in on the discussion? Maybe if they have a few questions, how will they contact us?
We have a blog page set up, and that will be released on the same day this podcast is released. There will be a space that you can leave comments, so people are free to leave comments anonymously and just let us know what they would like to hear about.
And also social media. We are in Facebook and other Twitter, Instagram. And we have the podcast will be originally posted in SoundCloud, so you can find us there as well. So they can post their comments and questions, and we can't guarantee that we will get through every single thing, but we will actually try our best to do what we can.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's it for today's episode. Join us next time on Theology Untapped.